So I would call it not a lecture, but rather some observations of mine as to where we are. Many friends of mine and political analysts would call current state of Russian-American relations as a kind of Cold War version 2. I disagree. It's not a Cold War. And the reason why it is not is that during the Cold War, we had a strong opposition of two ideologies that were governing the world and were splitting the world basically into big camps. So the fight between the ideologies that were supported by armed forces, collective organizations, and confrontational display of forces, basically in Europe, was something that was maybe the defining feature of the times of the Cold War. And also something that brought some discipline in the relations, some, if you will, organization of the world, the type of organization I wouldn't like to have repeated in the future, but it's fact of life. With the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, or maybe very late 80s, the ideological confrontation has gone away. Russia and former members of the Warsaw Pact as market economy-oriented countries as anybody else. The democratic values that are governing life in this country are not very different from what is basic democratic values in Europe. Sometimes they are applied somewhat differently. Sometimes we see that our Western friends are trying to privatize the right to define who is real democratic and who is not. But once again, irrespective of the differences of view and positions, especially in the political realm, there is no confrontational ideological divide in the world that was governing the Cold War. So it's different. Whether it's better than the Cold War or worse, it's a different story. Because the current relations are defined by quite different processes, quite different balances of forces, quite different understanding as to what is right and what is wrong, and I would say quite different discipline of political and international behavior, including implementation of the agreements of the past. And whether it's better or worse than the Cold War, the jury is still out. And the risk of confrontation, maybe even not pre-planned, most probably is as high as it was in the Cold War. And it's very disappointing. Now the question is, how we got where we are? When people are asking my view as to what is the current definition of the quality of Russian-American relations, and I would say that for a number of years, I keep repeating that it's at the lowest point after the end of the Cold War. And it's so disappointing that each and every year during the last years, this low point goes down, down, and down. Whether we have reached the bottom of it, I'm still not clear, and it's becoming more and more dangerous because of the force deployments, about the force posturing, political posturing, rhetorics, sometimes making a reasonable dialogue less and less available to all of us to work on issues that are seriously important to countries, both of the what we call collective West and Russia. But let's look back till the beginning of the 90s. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist, the United States were, in my view, kind of surprised. They had been working to help to dismantle the Soviet Union for quite a long period of time, but they didn't expect that it would happen, and it would happen so abruptly. And the reason, as far as I'm concerned, for the situation when the Soviet Union ceased to exist were purely internal Russian. But our American friends and the rest of the Western world believe that they won the Cold War, which I fully disagree with, because it's not them winning the Cold War, it's us deciding that the system that we had lived in for quite a long period of time didn't serve Soviet people the best way it could. So we have gone through a very difficult transformation, and as a result of it, the world was left with one military alliance and with one country that has believed that it's a pretty unique situation for them of a unipolarity in the world. And if you look into the memoirs of the book and the history books about this period and the internal American thinking about what would come next, you will see that the major discussions, maybe not public, and major thinking was invested in ensuring for the United States this unipolarity to become eternal. They were very much disappointed with the current change of the world, and the world is going through a huge transformation. I will address this a little bit later. And they have thought that the situation when the unipolar with the United States on the top of it could and should remain as long as they can assure it. The whole strategy of keeping unipolarity intact was guiding the policies of the United States military postures, and were guiding relations with the Russian Federation on the American side. We have gone through these 30 years a number of attempts, both by the United States and Russia, to make sure that our relations change to the better. We had Mr. Clinton, who was trying to befriend Mr. Yeltsin. We had Bush 43 or 41. 41 it was. No, 33. Who also was trying, at least was suggesting, that he was interested in building predictable relations with Russian Federation. They even have developed pretty warm personal relations with President Putin. We had Mr. Obama with his reset proposal, which initially was presented to us as not a reset, but what was the English? Перегрузка. What was the English word?
Yeah, they tried to use the Russian one. That was the trick.
But unfortunately, it proved to be true. And we had enormous change to the worse during Obama administration that was inherited by Trump. And what we are seeing now is the attempts by Russia and somewhat by the United States to build at least something reminding a attempts to build stability on the vestiges of the previous quite developed relations that we had. And why it was each and every attempt, and I would say both by the United States and Russia, to build something more positive failed. I'll give you my view, which most probably not fully shared by my American colleagues, but I think it's true. When Mr. Bush started warming up relations with us, it bumped first and foremost significantly with as it now can be found in a lot of memoirs in philosophy of the United States, buying out, I'm quoting the word, buying out Russia for the United States at that time. That was kind of thinking that was guiding the relations with us. It wasn't meant to be equally beneficial, and the United States were serving their own interests. Yes, they were helping somewhat us, they were helping with advice to build market economy, and history showed once again that it wasn't also that neutral, because it was always meant to be helping Russia to be part of the same unipolar world, the concept of which had been developed prior to Clinton and the Republican administration of Bush 41. And afterwards, all of this, I would say, bumped into very, very big political clash with the war in Serbia. The first war in Europe after the World War II that was launched by allegedly defensive alliance of NATO. The allies that claimed that they were doing something that was morally right and legally correct, but neither the definition was right and correct, because they didn't get approval by the Security Council, so they were acting in violation of their commitments under the UN Charter. And even morally, it has become a part of the drive by the West to divide to small pieces the Yugoslavia of the past, and also to have better control of this area by Western countries. We disagreed. We disagreed very seriously. I remember at that time I was serving as a Russian ambassador to NATO, and we had, I think, 7 or 8 meetings of NATO-Russia Council devoted to the situation in Serbia. And I was seeing and watching almost on a weekly basis how they were sliding down to the war in Europe, among other things, based on a lack of understanding of what they are dealing with, a lack of understanding of the future reaction of Serbia to the war that they would launch afterwards. We have explained to them everything that was wrong, and that is something that was very telling to us about NATO in the future. They don't listen to you, or even if they do not hear it, or they do not want to hear it. I will tell you that during these meetings that we had, a number of European countries were not very much eager to launch a war at that time in Europe, the first war in Europe after the World War II. And I was witnessing how the hands were twisted, how information was manipulated. We were trying to present the real view of what the Serbs were thinking, the Serbs were doing, and what they were not doing, because we understood the Serbs much better than anybody that recognized this. But Americans pushed everybody so hard, and they pushed themselves so hard in the situation where from which they found themselves at some point not able to make a U-turn. And that was very telling, and it's something that we need to take as a takeaway from the situation for the future about what needed is and what is not. With Mr. Bush, if you remember, that was quite different. There was another attempt to build relations. There was a famous meeting in Slovenia when he looked into the soul of Mr. Putin. You remember this famous phrase that Mr. Bush has used afterwards. And I think we even developed somewhat useful. I was at the time our political director negotiating the final documents of the meeting with the Americans. And I remember we have come up with a number of interesting ideas as to what the United States and Russia can do together. Afterwards, if you remember 9/11, Mr. Putin was the first to call Mr. Bush. And it wasn't meant to be a kind of display of solidarity for the sake of displaying it. Mr. Putin, who had been fighting terrorism back home for quite a while, most probably understood what the Americans were going through much better than any other leader in the world. And if you look into the history of these days, you will see that we undertook a number of steps in order to make life of Americans easier. We have discontinued even military maneuvers, not for them to be confused by the situation with a lot of airplanes flying around the United States and so forth, just to help them to cope with the situation on the hands. We did help them afterwards in fighting terrorist cells in Afghanistan. We did understand what they've gone through. And that was a moment that I was thinking would help us to build a really serious relations and a serious understanding of each other that will serve both the interest of the United States people and people of Russia. What it ended with two things. First, Americans, it's another takeaway for me from this period. Americans took it for granted. They didn't make best use of the rapprochement that was taking place between us to further develop our relations of an equal and mutually beneficial way. And the most significant reflection of the situation, in my view, is the decision to withdraw from the ABA Treaty. And that was the beginning of the end of the strategic stability as we know it. Because strategic offensive reductions have always been based on the understanding that together with these reductions we also have predictability in the anti-ballistic missile realm. But it's another side of American thinking that we have to keep in mind, and that you cannot rely completely on the agreements, because the treaty that they abandoned at that time was indefinite in duration. But Americans felt most probably comfortable to implement agreements as long as they do not constrain the sense of advantage in building capabilities. And at that time, most probably they understood that they have access to technologies that others wouldn't have. That's why they decided to bend the treaty rather than limit it. They built systems. It was a mistake. We told them, we explained to them, we tried to help them understand that we aren't going to sit idly and Washington to undermine the strategic balance. We said that we will take measures, most probably asymmetric, that would negate them any advantage that they might try to build in the anti-ballistic missile defense. Mr. Putin was very explicit in talking with Mr. Bush on this issue, and very honest. So what you see now as appearance of our new type of weapons with supersonic capabilities, it's a result of that developments that Americans decided to withdraw from the treaty, and we told them that we will have, as a reaction to this, to build capabilities to overcome the perceived advantage. The advantage didn't come in strategic, but the measures to negate the advantages have. Have we achieved a more stable world as a result? No. But it's another takeaway from American psychology, political psychology, that we need to be mindful of in the future when we are dealing with Americans. And most probably, it's not only the feature of the Republican administrations that we dealt with, because even at the Clinton time, prior to Mr. Bush, 43, when they understood that they are on the verge of developing some new technologies, they came to us and said, let's, I will put it in simplistic terms, reinvent the ABM treaty. They offered to us the so-called extended interpretation of the treaty. So they proposed to us to treat the language of the treaty that was very, very clear and well understood by both sides when we were signing it, to give it an interpretation that would allow them to develop systems that had been prohibited by the treaty from the very outset. It was Democratic administration. And then when Republicans came, they decided to do things straight. So they decided to abandon the treaty completely. What I'm talking about is that when you try to analyze the Americans as partners for arms control, it's you need to understand that they prefer to comply with the treaty as long as they serve the feeling of being able to take advantageous positions. By the way, and returning to Bush 43 period and date thinking, you know the name of Mr. Bolton, who is a very famous conservative and a very interesting interlocutor. I have worked with him on a number of issues. And you will be surprised, there are a number of things that we worked with him in a very successful manner on, because he has views, very strong views. Many of these views I will share and will appreciate. But he was one feature of his character. He delivers when we agree. And those who are interested in non-proliferation must probably know the resolution 1540 of the Security Council. That is considered to be one of the few really multilateral instruments that came in a useful fashion after the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was something that we negotiated within, two of us with our respective teams, and Americans delivered. They relies on the support of this resolution, which wasn't very clear in the very beginning, when a number of them would support it because they felt that they were bypassed by negotiation and negotiators. But returning to the philosophy that that administration was adopting for themselves and working with Russian security issues, they believed, and I think Mr. Bolton wrote about this himself in his first memoirs. He now issued the second. memoirs at the time he spent with Mr. Trump. But in his first memoirs, he very explicitly say that they agreed to have, you remember, a very strange arms control agreement that was very generically defined. They decided at the time that they need to have something with Russia. They didn't want anything specific. But Mr. Bolton himself was sure at the time, and he seemed to have convinced his president, that Russia would be falling down with its strategic capability anyway. And since it was going to lose its offensive capability, it was, they believe, they can sign anything. They will have upper hand anyway. That was the thinking behind the agreement that we signed at the time. Unfortunately, we tried to build something more specific with them on this issue. They didn't want to work seriously. But in any case, we had an agreement that was a kind of bridge to further negotiations in the future. But to the surprise of the United States, we didn't fall down. And we have introduced new generations and new systems of strategic offensive weapons. We still have parity in strategic offensive capabilities with the United States. But I'm telling all of this to you in order to help you to understand how we see our American colleagues when we are discussing the security issues with them now. Then we had Mr. Bum, who decided to have an attempt to build a kind of reset relations with Russia. If you read memoirs of then advisor on Russia of Mr. Obama's administration was Ambassador Monterey, who later became ambassador for 2 years in Moscow. He is explaining now also in his memoirs that what they were doing wasn't to serve Russian interests, it was their interest that they were trying to pursue. We understood that. Certainly we were not naive. But we felt that there would be enough room for both of us to find mutual accommodation in a way that would be serving not only theirs, but our interests as well. So we were very much responsible. But then we had a number of events that almost ruined very fast our relations. With the interference in the political atmosphere around elections in Russia into the Duma and then presidential elections, when then Secretary of State Ms. Clinton has launched almost a public campaign to put under the question mark the validity of the elections, especially into the Duma. Then we had a very bizarre situation with Mr. Snowden. And you might remember that this gentleman who revealed a lot of American secrets and then was hiding from American authorities in Hong Kong. And he decided to fly to Latin America.
To Cuba.
No, not to Cuba. Either Ecuador or I didn't quite remember which one. And to fly to Latin America, he had to take a flight to Moscow and then to take a plane and change plane and fly further. And our American friends didn't find anything better, anything smarter, than cancel his passport while he was in flight from Hong Kong to Moscow. And so when he arrived to Moscow, his passport was no longer valid. So not any air carrier would put him on board because he didn't have proper papers. He didn't have visa to Russia, and he didn't have a valid passport to go to Russia. So he got stuck in the transit zone. You might remember there was a Hollywood movie with Tom Hanks, I think, about this situation. However, in the movie, the whole story ended with the happy marriage. However, here it also ended with happy marriage, but with the girl that he had known even before he got to Russia. But what is important for Russian-American relations is that Americans decided to exert huge pressure on us to extradite Snowden to the United States. Whether we like Snowden or we don't like him, we don't have an agreement with the United States on mutual extradition. They have it with hundreds of countries plus minus. We have it with dozens of countries, but not with the United States. Because the United States never agreed to have such an agreement with us. We know why. Because there are a number of people who have blood on their hands who are hiding in the United States. But it's my explanation, not their official explanation, of course. So we do not have an agreement. We didn't have it when Mr. Snowden found himself in Sheremetyevo airport. And he came to us as a normal, peaceful person. He hasn't violated a single law in Russia. We didn't have any reason to arrest him and to extradite him. So legally it wasn't even doable. But Mr. Obama, he made a big issue of this, and he even canceled a scheduled Russian-American summit in St. Petersburg in order to protest on this issue. That was, I would say, the serious beginning of the worsening relations with them. Then the overturn of the legally elected government in Ukraine that Americans supported, not only supported but also were helping to implement. I'm not suggesting that they pre-planned and organized the Maidan and whatever. What I'm saying, and I think they were more relying on the European friends of ours to help evolution of political system in Ukraine. But when things were developing in a very unfortunate way, Americans were the first to take control of it, like all those American friends tried to do. And they were standing behind the overturn of the government. And everything that followed afterwards had brought us apart enormously. And that was the beginning of very big divide that was developing in Russian-American relations. Oh, I missed one additional issue that I want you to remember. And I'm returning back to Bush 43 period. The war in 2003 in Iraq. You remember the war was launched and at the pretext that they were trying to take away capability to produce weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We knew at that time there were none. And we have explained it to Americans, and it wasn't only us. But Mr. Blix, who was coordinating the International Commission, was telling the same. Mr. Elbaradi, who at the time was the head of International Atomic Energy Agency, both very decent and honest people, very professional. They all were saying that was nonsense. And even the French were more with us than with the Americans. But nevertheless, you remember this display General Powell showed the white powder capsule in the Security Council as a proof of allegedly biological weapon. Just think of it. Think of it. The Secretary of State would come with biological weapon to the Security Council. It would have been stupid enough from the safety point of view. So everybody knew it was false. It was false. But they launched a war. So when the war was over, the country that lived maybe not the most democratic way, but at the same time they were economically much better developed than many neighboring countries in the region. People have jobs, people were living the life that some of them enjoyed, and everything was demolished. And the Iraqis are still fighting the problems that Americans created there together with the Brits. And also the appearance of ISIS was defined by the policies of the American administration, who helped to fire all the military from the Iraqi army who found themselves. Previously, the military were a privileged few, not few, privileged class in the Iraqi society, both in terms of their status and in terms of the economic well-being. And they found themselves without a job in the streets. So they were easily recruited by the terrorists. So all of this were helped by mistakes of our American colleagues. But just think of it. As a result of this war, somewhere between 200,000 to 600,000, that's different estimates, and nobody gave me at any point in time any official estimations. But the basic estimations from 200,000 to 600,000 people were killed in Iraq. It's not the army, it were civilians. For what? What? And what our American friends said, of course we didn't find weapons of mass destruction, but it was useful anyway. I'm almost quoting President Bush at the time, because we toppled the tyrant. The country was almost, economy was demolished. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people killed. The ISIS structures created. I got this useful anyway. It's another takeaway as to what our American colleagues meant to the world. On top of that, we can add certainly situation in Libya. Also, like without proper mandate from the Security Council, because we abstain on a resolution that was introduced in Colombia, the introduction of overflights, so, but not on totaling the government. So, I'm returning to Ukraine with the situation around Crimea, where people who live in Crimea decided that the country that was built by extreme nationalists who came to power in Kyiv, it's not something that they wanted to live in, and Crimea had historically demolished Russia. So they decided to become part of Russia. We are being accused of annexing Crimea, and I vehemently disagree even with the notion of annexing, because we are not talking about the piece of territory, however it is also important. We are talking about millions of people who were threatened, who didn't want, because by majority, Russian speakers, Russian thinkers, and many of them Russian ethnic people. And it's their choice. And they even had a right to take decision on their future under Ukrainian constitution because they were autonomous region of Ukraine under the Ukrainian constitution. And we certainly embraced their decision to go on their own to become Russian, part of Russia. And all of this has created significant tension between us and the United States. The United States, together with allies, adopted a policy of containment of Russia. There are different words to be used by them on the policy. Deterrence, containment. Sometimes, I think it was in Atlantic Council speech of some American officials, constraining Russia. There are still three components of this strategy. One is military deployment next to our borders, that is, we see continuing to be on the rise. Economic depletion of our ability to develop through the sanction regime. And the third one is a kind of what I would loosely call brainwashing of Russian public opinion. And that's a real public relations war that was launched on us. At the same time, in the United States, the country politically has become very polarized. At the time I was serving as ambassador in the United States, I saw it myself. And having worked on the United States for almost all my professional life, I had never seen anything in terms of polarization of American society like it was happening in the second half of the Obama administration. And many political analysts say that the polarization came with Mr. Trump, but it's not the case. The polarization started with Mr. Obama, especially in his second term, when he had a fight with Republican-dominated Congress, and he decided to disregard a lot of decision and policy advice from the Congress and to go on its own using the powers of his unilateral issued decrees. So the Republicans were certainly going through the roof, and there was huge polarization developing, even at the time of Mr. Obama. That's why Mr. Trump, in my view, has won next election. When Mr. Trump came to power, the Democrats weren't able to agree with his victory. Their candidate was Ms. Clinton. And here once again, Russia appears already in domestic domain. It's a new dimension in Russian-American relations. When Democrats have launched a huge campaign to denigrate Mr. Trump, we were rather instrument, Russia was rather instrument than a big political issue for them. Instrument in fight against Mr. Trump because they were trying to prove that Mr. Trump came to power, if not illegally, but with the help of a foreign country. And if you ask what is the best candidate to be a boogeyman for Americans, it proved to be Russian because of the years of decades of the Russian-American confrontation. And what we were seeing here was a lot of false allegations, fantasies. I not only saw it myself, I was also the target of many of these accusations, which all of them proved wrong. And there was a long, almost 2 years investigation launched by the Congress that didn't prove anything about Russian involvement except for some lousy accusation of a number of people allegedly sitting in St. Petersburg, manipulating the United States. It's sheer nonsense. And just think of it. Biggest economy, democracy, the oldest democracy as they put themselves, the biggest is India, the oldest democracy, the most advanced democracy is so vulnerable that they were putting alleged Russian influence on them as a war. I'm almost quoting democracy in the Congress as a war against democracy in the United States launched by Russia. It's nonsense, complete nonsense, because we never launched any war, but even what was invented was sheer nonsense. And I'm sure that absolute majority of those who were using all of this against, not even Russia, against Trump, we were instrument rather than the target of this campaign. They knew it. They fully understood that. But it was something that was needed in the internal political war. And that's how Russia has become a major factor in internal American politics, which in turn leads to a situation where Americans, those who were fighting Trump, Mr. Trump, using as an instrument, the boogeyman, Russia, and those on Mr. Trump's side, who were trying to defend themselves by suggesting that they are tough with Russia, at the time where they have differences almost on each and every economic policy, on the environment. The Congress and the White House were paralyzed, even in adopting normal budgets. The only thing on which they were able to work as bipartisan was showing force, I'm quoting them, to Russia. At that time, in August 2017, they have adopted a law that for the first time, even in the Cold War, there was nothing of this sort. Russia was defined in a law as an adversary. So if that is the law, so all the policies that are definite have to be done as a policy to address an adversary. Knowing Americans pretty well, I doubt that they will be able to repeal such a legislation anytime soon. And as a result of it, we see a lot of internal politics or competition between the members of Congress, even a competition who can be seen more anti-Russian in the proposals. And there are multiple draft laws that are introduced each and every year, quote unquote, to punish Russia. To punish for what? I still don't know. And that's a reality, a current reality of our relations. And at the top of that, we see the current wave of accusation that we are planning a war against Ukraine. We see that on the backdrop of all these accusations, the activity of the military of the United States and NATO being on the rise around Russian borders. And we see a continuation of the threats to use economic instruments to constrain Russia. we are certainly very disappointed with the, I would say, the quality of the thinking on the Western side on all these issues. So we proposed an agreement. You must probably have seen it, it was last week. I'm not going to repeat each and every element of it, but there are two things that I would underline of importance. The one is that we are insisting that we try, both we and the Americans, try to return to where we started, to the time of founding act between Russia and NATO, in terms of defining the limits deployment of forces in NATO space. That we stop, they stop expansion of NATO. And there was a number of measures of confidence building that is included basically in the second area that we proposed with members of NATO organization in order to stabilize and to make the relations and to make it more predictable. So we are yet to see what they will come up as a result of it, but I would say that like all these Russian proposals is being criticized as being too drastic, and so forth. I'm not surprised, because if you look at the history of all our preceding negotiations and relations, that have always been the case, but we'll see what will be the official response. But what I would like to underline that we have a chance to reverse the current developments. If there is a serious negotiation on buildings reliable, and I would like to underline the word reliable, security arrangement in Russia, around our country. And that will serve not only our interest, it will serve interest of the Europeans and in the long term of Americans as well. But we will see what's going to happen next. And how we are doing with that.
Fine.
The question of reliability of our Western colleagues as partners. If you look at the short history that I was trying to address our relations now, and look, ABM treaty abandoned by the United States, INF abandoned by Americans, like it is usual for them, blaming us for allegedly not complying with it. But it's not only true, but also the truth is that for more than 20 years, Americans were violating a number of provisions of this treaty. And we have been trying to address it with them in the bilateral commission that was established to help the treaty to be implemented. And there are a number of things that they were violating. If you are interested, I will tell you. But the open sky is abandoned as well. With the deployment of anti-ballistic missile systems in Europe, initially the geography of the deployment that was designed at the time of Mr. Bush 43, allegedly to protect Europeans against missiles coming from Iran and North Korea. Just think of the geography. North Korea was designed, we understood it from day one, certainly to prepare deployment of systems against us. And we explained to them that we understand everything. We changed it somewhat, but nevertheless, we have deployed systems in Romania, like Poland. And also they're telling us that they are deploying defensive anti-ballistic missile systems. And I just want you to take note of that. The systems that they are deploying are called launch system MK41. That's something that my president refers to quite frequently. MK41 is a universal launching system that was designed for the American maritime Navy fleet. The system is universal. You can put in there cruise missiles on the classic Tomahawk. You can put there anti-missile system like SM-3 that is designed to intercept the ballistic missiles. You can put there almost anything because it was designed to be universal. Now they're telling us, since this system MK41 is no longer put on the ship, but put on the land, that's a different thing. And under this guise of defensive system, you can put there, and it's minutes, Tomahawk or any missile that they can develop in the future. That would be very close to our borders, Romania, Poland. And we have explained to them, we have engineers, we have military specialists. They are as good as Americans are. And we are able to calculate ballistic trajectories. We know how these systems work. And we explain to them that we fully understand what they are doing. But they continue to say, no, it's made to deploy defensive systems. It's not true. And it's probably not true. And it's something as a takeaway as to how our American friends operate with us on these issues. They could have been more truthful, at least. That would have been serving stability and predictability. So that's where we are. It's not a very happy picture that I brought to you, but I wouldn't say that it's hopeless. At least we think we can do a lot of things in order to help to reverse the trend. When it comes to defense of Russia, I'm pretty confident that we will ensure that under any circumstances, we and our allies are going to be protected. But we would like to see it happen in the environment of predictability, on the basis of cooperative security that we have been talking for so many years about and have never achieved as a method of working together. That is something that is very much missing in the relations with America so far. Thank you.
Thank you for your so comprehensive message, and you could guess it would not necessarily be very optimistic rather than realistic. Actually, in preparation for our today's meeting, I was looking into your presentation you made in Geneva at one of the PIR Center's meeting, and it was almost literally almost exactly 4 years ago in December 2017. And actually it was still a slightly different picture domestically in the United States, so maybe not slightly different, but very different. But with all that, you were saying 4 years ago that you see very low opportunity for any administration, for Trump or for any other, to resume productive, serious cooperation with the Russian Federation. And then you mentioned that whether there is any chance of changing that, whether it should be some change of generations in the United States of politicians, or that's maybe hopeless because with the change of generations of politicians, strategic view of Russia would not change. So we will come to the students' questions just next, but this will be my question today. How will you see that in the future, whether that strategic rivalry and the view of Russia as adversary is will be built in the next generation of American politicians, or we need a Cuban Missile Crisis #2 or something else bad to happen, or maybe you see a different recipe for that? Thank you.
Thank you. How much time do I have? Because it's a very serious and serious question. First, I would say that there is a Russian-American rivalry. At least we are not involved. We do not see ourselves involved into rivalry. We are a self-sufficient country. We do not aspire for the same kind of hegemony that Americans are trying to ensure for themselves. The picture is much more complex, the transformation of the world. The world is becoming multi-centric, where the Americans want it or not. And Russia is only part of it. Very important to us, very important for the world as well, especially taking into account our situation, geographical situation, our capacities, both economic capacities and military capacities, and also our support for international order that will be based on international law. It's a factor, but it's not the only one. Just think of it, by the mid-century, by all serious estimations, economic power #1 will be China. And the World Bank gave an estimation that by the 2040-2045, the economy of China will be 1.4 of the volume of America. Before the change to the world balance of forces, that will be less giving them a chance to control everybody. That is something that is very much on their mind, and they are trying to do it now before it is too late. That's why, in my view, is increasingly aggressive posturing of the United States in the world. Aggressive not necessarily fighting wars, but aggressive politically, economically, trying to build alliances, coalitions of the willing, because alliances require a lot of legal instruments that are not available to them, and even creating new alliances. The alliance with the Brits and Australia in Asia, or Pacific rather, that is presumably is designed to contain China, but it also is something that we need to have in mind because we are there. We are in Asia. So that's why this aggressive way of posturing together with the allies, that's why we see so much of electricity and everything that they are doing. And in the heightened electricity environment, it's easier to put under your umbrella all your allies who might dare otherwise to be more independently thinking. That's what is happening, especially in Europe, especially with the increase propaganda war against Russia, presenting us as aggressor or potential aggressors. That's what is happening. Now, provided both them and us would be willing and capable of starting rebuilding our relations, how long it will take them to be more realistic and more reasonable on this issue. 4 years ago, I was addressing it, suggesting that it will take several generations. But when I said generations, I meant generations of politicians. So I had in mind, and I still think the same, I had in mind election cycles. Because currently, if you look at the Congress, and I said already that most probably one of the few things that they are able to work on bipartisan basis is things that are anti-Russian. So there is a generation of current politicians elected in Congress who are making the campaigning, who are collecting money for the campaign, who are promoting themselves as politicians, who are building political alliances against each other. They are profiling themselves in significant fashion on anti-Russian feelings. So for them to make a U-turn, that is very, very different. Whether it will take another Cuban crisis type of situation in order to change mentality, God forbid. We do not need any calamities in the future. We, in Russia, we have had enough in our history. We need to work based on reason and mutual respect. That's our preferred option. But in order for Americans to change mentality, collective political mentality on Russian-American relations, most probably it will take a kind of number of fresh minds coming to power, into the Congress. People who are able to look afresh on what reality is, or what the truth is sometimes, because there are so many lies spread around about our countries. And it's each and every day something very disappointing. And that would require a kind of critical mass of fresh faces in political realm in the United States. Because absolute majority of those who are very active in this, they have made their political capital anti-Russian subjects. That's why I said it will require a number of generation of politicians, not generation of people. So it's shorter than, because generation of people is 20 years. Generation of elections in the States is 2 years for the lower chamber, and 1/3 of the Senate is re-elected in 2 years. So it will take 8 to 10 years at least, provided everything else is developing well. It's my personal estimate. I might prove wrong. I would love to be proved wrong and to see the reason coming back to the United States political elite faster. But it's something that we need, it's something they need.
Thank you, Sergei Ivanovich, and now I'm ready to just take questions. First, okay, I see. Alexandra.
Yeah, I think this is the best.
Okay. So, and it will be up to you. We can take question by question and then collect a few questions.
You will choose.
Okay, let's start with question by question. Alexandra and then Artem.
Thank you, Sergei Ivanovich, for your lecture. If you say that there is no ideological confrontation in this narrow sense of Cold War between the United States and Russia today, does it mean that Russia has already lost its position of the enemy number one because the United States now finds an ideological enemy not in Russia but in China?
Whether we lost position enemy number one, I wouldn't compete for that kind of position. Something that we do not need. But if you try to quote our American colleagues, especially those who are developing these strategic concepts, they say that the long-term, they're not using the word enemy, they're using the word adversary, is China. In the shorter term, it's Russia. So whether China is number one, if it is somewhat longer term, and Russia is, I don't know, and I do not care. If you look at the strategic documents, especially developed during the Trump era, because the current administration hasn't published yet the strategic documents. They are going to come out somewhere in the end of this year, beginning of the next. But in previous administration, especially during the time of Advisor on Security Matters, General McMaster, who was very strategically thinking, and he was developing a view that the main challenge strategically for the United States is Eurasia. And he brought in the concept of tailor-made deterrence to different parts of Eurasia. Eurasia is Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. And what kind of tailor-made deterrence they are developing, for you to better understand, but that was kind of integrated view of the United States of what they need to deter Eurasia. And who is number one and number two in Eurasia? It's for them to decide. I prefer to build something more predictable and reasonable in our relations, because we need predictability, even if we do not like each other very much. Yes?
Thank you. Artyom and then Chip.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Kislyak, for your insightful lecture. I really like the way you frame our relations at this point. During your presentation, you frequently referred to American political philosophy and American political psychology. Well,
I never used the word philosophy. I've never used psychology.
Yeah, and when you were referring to these terms, to these notions, I actually started to think that Russia itself also has its own political philosophy and psychology that can influence the dynamics of our bilateral relations. So, for instance, you were saying that the world is becoming multipolar, but at the same time, Russia continues to insist that we still need a strategic balance between Russia and the United States that would be unique, that would be different from all other aspects of international relations. But at the same time, we see that there are more and more division lines in the world, that different kinds of adversaries exist for different countries. So basically, what we see is that there is no strategic balance between Russia and China. There is no strategic balance between just China and the United States. There are no regional balances. But Russia still has this narrative that a balance is needed. There is no balance between the United States and North Korea. And I'm wondering, is it really a feasible principle that we can use to foster our future cooperation? Because this is simply something that does not really resemble how the world looks today, if we see that it is really becoming multipolar. Thank you.
Thank you. First, why did I use the word balance? Strategic balance with the United States or any other countries? Maybe with the United States, yes. We are in a balance currently. And whether we like it or not, the US and Russia have the biggest nuclear capabilities in the world. All other countries combined do not have as many nuclear weapons and delivery systems with delivery capabilities comparable with that of the United States and Russia. And that is why we have, when I say we, I am saying Russia and the United States have not only desired to have a balance, or should have desired to have a balance, but also, I would say, have a special responsibility for maintaining stability in our relations. Because in case of confrontation between Russia and the United States today, the risk is of a nuclear war that would annihilate the rest of the world as well. And currently it's only Russia and the United States that do possess that kind of capabilities. When I was talking about polycentric world, I wasn't very much thinking about nuclear capabilities. I was thinking about economics. Economics being political influence, political arrangements and alliances. And I would love to see that we compete in economics rather than in nuclear weapons or conventional weapons that are becoming more and more capable to replace nuclear weapons because of its power and its precision. So whether you invite me to offer you a formula for the balance of nuclear forces that would include all other countries, I would say that I do not have enough imagination to offer you a formula as to how to build it. Because even the Chinese capabilities are significantly more than anything that Russia and the United States have. The French, the United Kingdom are also important. Of course they are important, but it's not anything to compare with that of the United States or Russia. And when it comes to India and Pakistan, it's more theater capabilities, theater range, rather than strategic. So we are talking about different situations for different regions in this regard. But when it comes to the major responsibility for strategic stability, so far it lies on the shoulders of the United States and Russia. It might change in the future, and most probably will. And I would love to see a situation when we develop a kind of collective approach to all of these issues, something that is yet to be achieved.
Yeah, Chip, and after that I suggest we collect the questions.
However you
And then Ambassador Kislyak can either respond to all of them or select. The next will be Rebecca.
Thank you. My question concerns, fundamentally how there's a different set of facts in the United States government perspective versus Russia. For example, you talked about Ukraine and Crimea, and your description of it is obviously very different than what is going to come out of the State Department, for example.
Yes.
So I was wondering how you think we can resolve our differences on such issues while we're working on a fundamentally different set of facts? Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely correct. We have different narratives of the same facts. That is correct, because we know what we are talking about. We were there, because under the agreement with Ukraine, we had military forces there. We were entitled to have 25,000 troops. At the time in Crimea, we had, I think, at the time, around a dozen. Moreover, we also enjoyed enormous interaction with Crimea on a human-to-human basis, because absolute majority of people, even those serving in Russian fleet, were Crimeans. The officers have been living there with their families for generations. So for us, it's not something that was absolutely foreign, unknown. That was, in a way, extension of our history. For Americans, it's absolutely different. It's a geography, it's a failure of the government that they have to bring to power in Kyiv. And they even didn't care too much to look into what the people who lived in Crimea felt about events in Kyiv. But when the nationalists came to power in Kyiv, just think of it. They threatened Crimeans with the so-called friendship trains. Most probably you are too young to remember what it was. Friendship trains, it's part of Russian history, not only Russian, all the countries of Comecon, where we were sending trains with students, art performers, musicians to countries of Warsaw Pact to build friendship. And it was very popular kind of program that we had. So these nationalists came and said, we will send you friendship trains. So they put what we call боевики,
Guerrillas.
Huh?
Guerrillas.
It's not guerrilla, it were the nationalists, well armed. They sent it to Crimea to teach them what was right for them after the new government in Kyiv. You might wish to look, even in YouTube, you can find a lot of other material and written material as well about these days here. And Crimeans, they came with bits, with shields to a power station, to Middlebury, because they knew that those attackers would be attackers, was a threat. The very first thing that the newly established elite in Kyiv launched in their parliament was a ban on the use of Russian language. It was initiative number one, think of it, at the time of big changes in Ukraine. And in Crimea, absolute majority of people, not only being Russian ethnically, but also ethnic Ukrainians living there. They spoke Russian, they think Russian, they teach their kids Russian. And what they've been offered from Kyiv to ban the ability to lead the way their ancestors and themselves have been living generations. And I can continue all of this. There are so many things that were developing because by the nationalists in Kyiv, Crimea was considered to be the most important hotbed of resistance for them, for everything they came to power with. And that's why we understood the sentiment of these people. Look, at that time, Ukrainians had also forces in Crimea, military forces, Ukrainian part of the fleet, the Air Force, the paratroopers. 75 or 80% of those, they took oath and became Russian military. Because they didn't, not because they were fearful of anything, because they were given a right to go to Ukraine. We even provided them cars, provided railway cars to help them, together with their families, for those who didn't agree with Crimea becoming Russian, to live in peace. For some, we even allowed to leave Crimea with weapons. But absolute majority of the people who served in Ukrainian army in Crimea, they also agreed with the change, they stayed there. For us, it was a situation with Russian brothers, with people who lived the same way as we did, to decide to remain with us, rather to live in a country that denies everything that was sacrosanct for them, including the victory in the World War II. And that's what we saw happening. That's why we embraced their decision to become Russian citizens. And it was mostly about power, and secondly about the territory that they lived in. Yes.
Thank you. Now we have, we'll collect 3 or 4 questions. Now Rebecca and then Edward and then Dasha.
Hello, thank you for your lecture and your points. We have talked a lot about the United States and Russia, but we have also mentioned NATO, and inside of NATO there are mostly European countries. Since most of the agreements that have failed, like the ABM and the INF, territorially involved Europe, and also the situation in Crimea involves Europe, what do you think is the position of Europe right now? What do you think it could become in the future? Do you see a shifting of position in some European countries? What would you say?
Okay, thank you. The place of Europe in all that, Edward.
Thank you, Sergei for your presentation today. So earlier you mentioned the anti-Russian campaign that involved military technical measures, a combination of economic and information psychological operations. I know that in the United States, to the public, it's often sold that sanctions are some sort of de-escalatory measure, and that's quite a misconception because it does have quite an offensive nature. Are there any other tools that the United States uses that they sell as a de-escalatory or defensive measure that you think are misunderstood and actually have quite an offensive nature?
Okay, and now Dasha.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your in-depth analysis. My question regards the Federal Assembly role in devising the Russian foreign policy and security policy. So, to what extent does actually Federation Council Committee on Foreign Affairs influences the process of formulating and defining the foreign policy of Russia today?
Shall we?
Yes. The easiest part, the role of Council of Federation. The role of the Council of Federation is meaningful, but it's not exactly defining everyday steps that the foreign policy of Russia is taking. We have the right to ratify agreements. We are the ones who are approving or rather consulted with nomination of ambassadors. that also involves analysis of the policies with which the would-be ambassador goes to his post. We have a number of instruments to work on issues of importance to Russia that would require changes or evolution of Russian legislation in order to support foreign policy. So that is basically the role of the Foreign Relations Committee that is involved in that. And also, that is becoming more and more active, I would say, even at the time of pandemic, is interaction with the parliaments of other countries. And it's also important both to understand what the legislative powers of other countries, what powers of the legislation authorities in other countries are planning to do. We have developed contacts with them in order to better understand each other, and that means to understand what is real and what is less than real in terms of agreements to be reached, supported by the legislatures of both countries, and also sometimes to be ratified by both countries. It's very active now in this respect with countries with our allies in Central Asia and Belarus. We have special arrangements working with them. There are a number of fora of cooperation between the parliamentarians of BRICS, of other organizations, and some regional organizations. Last week, I was very much involved in developing the final documents of Pacific Parliamentary Forum. Very interesting. At the first time I was doing this job there. Very interesting discussions, because people there have very different perspectives of the world stability from us. And there were Canadians, Australians, Malaysians, so a very interesting mix of countries with absolutely different culture of parliamentary work. So it's important for enlarging understanding of how the other countries operate. Also, we participate, I'm the head of a Senate component of Russian delegation in the PIS, Parliamentary Assembly of Europe. That is something that is requires a separate conversation. At some point, if you invite me, I can tell you how dreadful it is now, and how different it is from what it is was designed initially for. But nevertheless, it's also part of political discourse with our European colleagues. Now I moved to Europe and the positions. When you ask me what Europe thinks and what their position is, the first reaction, or my reaction would be asking you what Europe you are talking about. We are different. When people say that EU is Europe, I fully disagree. Because we are Europe as well. And if you look at the map and take a, say, distance between Russian Western border and Malta, Euros, it will be about the same as between Russian Western border and Portugal. And we also, culturally wise, is, in my view, predominantly European. Moreover, the reason why Russian Far East isn't Chinese is because Russians have moved European culture there centuries ago. So for me, we are not only European, we are Euro-Pacific country with European, predominantly European culture. However, we are multi-cultural, we are multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-everything. But I perceived ourselves as predominantly European country. Now, returning to what you probably were asking about, the European narrow definition of it. It's also different. Americans at some point defined, say, Europe as two-part entity, Old Europe and New Europe. Old Europe is French, the French, Germans, Italians, Spaniards. The New Europeans are those who joined NATO and the EU after the end of the Cold War. And those are, in terms of relations with Russia, absolutely different Europes. With different psychology. I remember the time when Americans and other Western colleagues of ours were trying to convince us that the expansion of NATO would be, I'm quoting, serving long-term strategic and political interests of Russia, because, that was the argument, having joined NATO, the countries of Baltics or Eastern Europe will feel secure. And feeling secure, there will be better neighbors for Russia than otherwise. I was smiling and joking about this because we knew what was happening. We knew why these people were trying to build the capitalizing newly elected members of NATO and trying to make themselves visible, make them a majority of those countries, to put it bluntly, are not exactly contributors to collective security of NATO. But they want to be seen equal, they want to be seen important, and one of these instruments for them is being anti-Russian. That's what is happening with Lithuania, especially Latvia, somewhat Estonia. But it was understood for us, by us from day one, and that's exactly what happened. Poland is another example, but it's a certainly bigger country. So they have a very determined collective position to make best use of bigger European organizations, the transatlantic organization, to pursue the anti-Russian agenda. We know, and when I was joking about PACE, it's about that, where they have established a group that is called Baltic Plus. The only agenda they have is fighting Russia delegation in the PACE. Sometimes it's a laughing stock as to what they're doing. Sometimes it's annoying, but it's never healthy. But when we are focusing on real issues that PACE is dealing with, like social economic rights of people, like security of people, we found ourselves much more in serious dialogue with other countries, what the Americans call Old Europe. We have agreements and disagreements with them. Those are honest differences of views. We treat them with respect, and I would say they treat our views also with much better respect. When it comes to these Baltic Plus, and Ukrainians certainly are being the most visible personalities in this fight, it is becoming annoying not only for us, it's becoming annoying for Western or all Europe, even in peace as well. But it's part of the current picture of the world. We'll see what is going to happen next. Sanctions as an instrument of de-escalation, that's nonsense. Because sanctions is an instrument of pressure first. Secondly, and that is most important and something that is less paid attention to, sanctions are frequently used as an instrument to fight economic competitors. And we saw it happening. Look, for example, at the fight our American colleagues are launching and waging against Nord Stream 2. The fight in the Congress is led by senators from Texas. They are in the lead. The others are supporting for political reasons. But senators from Texas, who certainly economically, financially are supported by the companies that serve in the election campaigns, they are fighting for the market for American companies producing gas, natural gas. The way they produce gas is much more expensive than extracting gas in Russia, because they are using, what is it, I forgot the English term, with the use of explosions.
Fracking.
Huh?
Fracking.
Fracking? No, it's not fracking. It's maybe fracking. Whatever. They use a force of an underground explosion in order to generate gas extraction from reserves. So it's much more expensive and somewhat ecologically more dangerous, I would say. Nevertheless, it's money, so it's being done. Moreover, in order to bring this gas to Europe, you need to liquefy it, to put it on ship, to bring it to you, de-liquefy it, and then to deliver it to the consumer. So the price, even if they, yes, it was fracking, if they can lower technologically the price of fracking to reach the same price of extraction like it is in Russia, the other part of the delivery system is making it prohibitively expensive for the Europeans. So in order to open the market for American gas, and they believe that in the future they will have abundance of gas, which is yet to be proved in the future, they will have to stop massive delivery of gas from Russia. It's competition. And that's why they're fighting using Stream 2, Nord Stream 2, using all kind of political instruments in order to open up the market for Americans. What is happening now? The European Commission has established a policy, collective policy of for the European countries that is relying more and more on spot market rather than long-term contracts that they have with us, and still have a number of countries have with us on gas delivery. The spot market now goes through the roof for several reasons. One is climate, secondly, miscalculations, third, expectations by major European countries that by this time they would have bigger chunk of energy production made by green technologies, which didn't happen. Plus, they were hoping that Americans will be delivering less expensive gas to the market that they had been doing in previous years. And what happened? The American companies, which are private, of course, now prefer to deliver their gas not to Europe, but to Asia, mainly to China. The ideologically adversary China, they send their gas to China rather than Europe. And now they accuse us of not delivering enough to the European market in order to lower the prices in Europe. It's mind-blowing, but it's the way they operate. It's money. That's huge money. I would add one amazing thing. And so sanctions here, I certainly call it an instrument of stabilization of relations. One amazing figure, Russia, currently, on the backdrop of all the animosities that we enjoy now with Americans, has become supplier number 2 of oil, crude oil, to the United States. We are number 2 after Canada. It's amazing. In previous years, at the time of late Obama and Trump administration, our trade has dropped to $23 billion a year, plus minus. It's almost nothing. And it's, if you compare it with our trade with Europe, it's almost non-existent. Currently, it's about 40 billion. On the backdrop of all this animosity, because market serves them well, and they do not hesitate to buy Russian products if it serves American interests. I don't blame them for that, but we need to remember always that you need to follow money, trying to understand some of American policies. Давайте еще последний вопрос откроем.
Yep, sir, давайте, да. Коротко, just short questions, please, and Ocean, Alexandra, and Sam. Ocean.
So, thank you for your presentation of your remarks about US-Russian relations. My questions are very more philosophical, so maybe it's not that short for the answers. First, I wanted to know if you would define Russia's foreign policy strategy or stance to be kind of always as a reaction to US perspective or other actors. So, is it because of certain events that Russia is actually stepping up in the foreign policy? Because from the literature, it's how it appears. And finally, according to agonistic theories, I don't know if you're familiar with it, it's pretty new. It's in response to Schmidt theories of antagonist relations in international relations. It's from Mouffe and Kuhn. Basically, the idea is that actors need to have a clear boundary between the us and the other. And this boundary authorizes each actor to acknowledge the other as a legitimate adversary, I would say. And that you want to compete with without annihilating it, okay? And do you think...
Would you kindly repeat it? I didn't quite get it.
Yeah, no problem. That's kind of complicated because it mixes a lot of things. So agonistic theories comes with the idea that you have different actors, that each of them defines themselves as the us. So
Axis.
the us.
Us.
The us.
We.
The we.
Нас,
Nas, da. And the other, so the other actor. We can say "Mina strani" if you prefer in Russian. And this boundary authorizes each actor to acknowledge the other, so the other person, as an adversary that is not willing to annihilate, destroy, because he is a legitimate adversary, okay? So my question was more about, do you think that with this new multicentric, polycentric world, it is possible to define this antagonistic relation and to define stable limits in relationships with different states? Maybe that's a bit complicated. That's very philosophical. I'm sorry.
It's quite complicated.
Yeah, we need some extra coffee for that, and probably
Yes.
extra hour. But I think it's actually a good question. Alexandra and so.
Well, my question is not so complicated, Your Excellency. I wanted to ask you about the latest drafts on treaty on NATO guarantees. Because there was much criticism, both from American and Russian experts, that this document is actually weak because Russia doesn't propose anything in return, and that the U.S. that it wants just some unilateral commitments from the U.S. So I would like you to comment on that, please, and do you have any ideas, if you agree, how we can make this, how could we make this document stronger? Thank you.
Okay, and Sarah?
Your Excellency, my question de facto was the previous one, but I would like to ask you if there are any benefits that our Western counterparts could take from this treaty. Because in the case when there are no such benefits, why should they sign it?
Benefits from what?
Benefits from this Russian proposal.
Yeah. I will try to
Thank you.
combine your two questions. They are very much similar. First of all, I don't agree with the notion that we didn't offer anything in the draft agreements on our side. Because if you look especially at the text of the draft agreement proposed to NATO, we're talking about the sides. So each side needs to follow commitments that are there. Secondly, the draft agreement with NATO is more about confidence building. The measures that would make our relations more stable, that certainly includes limitations on us. And it's about mutual restraint in military activities. Look into the text. And it's mutual. They are arguing that Russia is aggressive, not us. And we are offering mutual restraint, including, and that is most probably most vivid condemnation, more than telling you, including establishing a belt of security, if you will, coming on both sides from our border with NATO countries, both in Russia and in NATO countries, where we propose not to have exercises with the forces larger than one brigade. It's very limited, one brigade. And that means that if along the border between Russia and NATO countries, there will be no exercise, including Russian exercises, along the border, bigger than one brigade, that would give a sense of confidence that no invasion, no provocation is being planned. It's very important, because look at what is happening now with all these accusation of Russia that we are amassing forces next to Ukrainian forces. First, we are not amassing forces there, 250 kilometers from the border, the deployments that they are referring to. But secondly, if we establish a regime on mutual basis that will give confidence that you can sleep calmly in the night, and not wait for aggression coming through the border, it will be very much serving interest of the other countries. And here I'd like to say that this mutuality is certainly something that should serve the interest. Secondly, I would say that it's not us who are pushing Russian alliances to them. It's them who are coming to us. That's why we are raising the issues that are major concern to us. Whether we should offer something additionally to serve the interest of our colleagues on the other side of negotiations, I can assure you that if they decide to join a dialogue on these issues, they will bring a lot of things that they will ask us to do in order to enjoy better life as they see. So what we put on the table is a set of proposals that, in our honest view, serve not only Russian interest, but the interest of our interlocutors, or potential interlocutors. Whether we need to write down each and every element that is concerned to them about us, that would be to be commissioned to offer us to to do, they will do it at some point if they decide to negotiate. But what is important that whatever they decide to do about our proposal, they need to take very seriously what we put on the table, because those issues that are included in our plans are really issues that are of concern to us. I would add to this that remembering the beginning of other arms control negotiations quarter century ago, even in the Soviet Union times, the first drafts that we proposed, and I say our American friends proposed to us, were absolutely incompatible. Because we see the world, we see the security issues differently. And in many situations, it's objective reality. We see things differently. So before you can agree on issues, you need to sort out as to what we are talking about, why you are talking about this issue, and how it can be remedied. And it's certainly a very complex issue to deal with. But it certainly requires serious negotiations and serious involvement. But we'll see. We haven't seen any reaction so far on these issues, so I cannot comment on what our Western colleagues would come up with. When it comes to our being reactive to what our Western colleagues are doing, yes, in many cases we were reactive, especially after the end of the Cold War. Look at the 90s. We were trying to understand what course of internal developments Russia was going to take. It was a very difficult period. It was very difficult to define what Russia is going to be, and I would say that before we took seriously the course of market economy development, I just wanted to say, you might remember, you cannot remember because you were most probably too young at the time. There were discussions in the Russian society as to whether we should adopt Western style economies or return back to the Soviet style. And there was a period of time where the Communist Party that was representing the view that we need to return back was very strong. At some point they were taking, if not the majority of the seats in the Duma, but significant chunk of the voices was there. But it's not only numbers that is important. It means that not all of the Russian society was ready to move to the market economy and to the development of the country we enjoy now. At that time, economically we were in very difficult shape. The military wasn't paid even decently. The state of our armed forces wasn't in good shape. However, we have managed a number of enormously important things, taking full control in a responsible way of nuclear weapons, repatriating them from other countries of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. There was enormous operation and enormous responsibility that was lying on our country in this field. And we've come through all of these challenges, I think, with flying colors, irrespective of the difficulties that we lived in this period. So, very nervous situation when Russia has become more independently minded. That is one of the problems that way. Yeah. When it comes to legitimate adversary status to other countries, with due respect, it's too sophisticated question for me to attempt to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for your question and your interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Sergei Ivanovich, for your time.